Lord bless you and keep you.
Well, hello everybody. The last time I had a Saturday conversation, you may recall, it was Gary that we had a look at, and we just delved into the man behind the dog collar, and it was really quite light-hearted. Today I want to explore a rather more serious subject, which has been born out of a split-second happening in somebody's life, which was life-changing. And the point being, it was not just life-changing for the person it happened to. In fact, the conversation today is very much about the effect it had on another person. So I want to introduce you to Janet, who is my sister-in-law. We both married one of 6 siblings in the Pointer family. I married Margaret, who I think is number 5, and Janet married Martin, who's number 2. Martin and I went to the same school as it happens, but not at the same time. And he was also my best man. Whilst our conversation is much about Janet, the first thing I'm going to ask her to do is to give us a short understanding of what happened on one fateful day to change her and Martin's life forever. But before I tell you that, and I tell you he was a very successful barrister at QC. They had a house in London to use in the week and a beautiful but working farm in Lincolnshire, where they spent much time and effort renovating it and improving it. And then with Janet becoming a serious, committed sheep farmer. So to have the conversation with Janet, we need to then just find out what happened to Martin. So Janet, I'm really grateful to you for joining me for this. And I know some of it might be a little difficult for you. And again, we're really thankful. So the first question is, can you set the scene? What happened?
Well, good morning, Mark, and good morning, people who tuned in. It was about 3 years ago. Martin was in London, as would be usual during the week, and I was already up at the farm in Lincolnshire because we were right in the middle of lambing. So Martin was driving up the A1 to come home, and he had a massive stroke whilst driving on the A1. And because of the stroke that he had, he lost control of the car and it careered at speed into a tree. And that collision caused horrendous physical injuries for Martin. But the worst thing was that the impact also had an impact on his brain. So he had traumatic brain injury. It used to be called brain damage. Now they call it traumatic brain injury. So Martin was airlifted to Addenbrooke's Hospital, where he spent 6 months. He was in a coma for 5 weeks of that. And the reason he was there for so long was because they had to stabilize him medically. And that's how long it took them to stabilize him. From there, the degree of his brain injury was such that they decided to send him to a neurological rehabilitation unit for 6 months. And that was in London. So that was a little bit easier for me to go and visit him. After 4 months, they told me that regrettably, Martin had not really responded to the therapies that they were using, and that he had what they called plateaued. In other words, he wasn't going to progress any further. And so after 4 months, he was discharged from there to a neurological care home. And the purpose of this was to assess his care needs, so that when he came home or went into a nursing home, whichever was decided, I was always going to have him home, we would know what his care needs were in terms of equipment and care provision. And he was supposed to be there for 6 weeks while they did this assessment, but unfortunately the first lockdown happened and he ended up being there for 7 months, which was pretty traumatic because he just declined even further than he needed to in that time. But it did give me time to make a lot of changes that needed to be made. So the first thing I did was I sold the house in London. It was a relatively easy and simple decision. There was no way Martin was going to be able to live in a 3-story terraced house with staircases everywhere. So that was sold. Then I had to grapple with the slightly more difficult decision of selling the farm. And I consulted members of the family, yourself included. I consulted Martin's children. And we all agreed that it was the right thing to do. And in fact, once we'd sort of agreed that, the decision was much easier than I thought it was going to be. And for this reason, well, there were two reasons really. One was the farm was all about Martin and I doing things together. We built up the farm together, we planned things together, and that was no longer going to happen anymore. Martin was in no fit state to do anything on the farm. But the second reason that made it an easier decision than I sort of suspected it would be was the potential that it would torment Martin to be at the farm and not be able to partake in any activities on the farm, which he really wouldn't be able to do. And that was a great concern, particularly to his children, that it would be a torment to him. So I sold the farm as well. So suddenly the two sort of physical pillars of our relationship were gone. And I bought a bungalow in the next village because I didn't want to leave the community, because having sort of divested myself of the physical pillars of our relationship, I certainly didn't want to get rid of all the social and friendship contacts that we had. So I found a big bungalow. It was pretty new, so all the doors were wide enough to get his wheelchair through, and it was all hard floors and flat surfaces with virtually no thresholds. And with very little amendment, I was able to make it work very well for Martin's homecoming. And he came home 18 months after the event happened, and he's now here safe and comfortable and happy. So that's what happened to us in a nutshell.
So as we've said, you know, something that happens in a split second can have an absolutely massive impact on everything, absolutely everything. So, right, we're up to date with what happened and where you are now. So my first question to you is, I know you were both really, really happy with the life that you had and the farm and all those things. When you look back now, do you regret what you've had to give up?
I don't look back very much. I didn't find it very helpful to keep looking back. I tend to live very much in the moment now, and a little bit of future, because one needs to have a few eyes on what's going to happen. So I think I can say I don't regret the loss of that. And there are two things that have really helped that. And I can honestly say that I really knew how good our life was at the time, and I really appreciated it. So I don't look back, Mark, and I don't look back to say, oh, if only I'd known how good it was then, if only we'd done this or we'd done that or made better use of our time. Because the fact is, we lived life to the full, Martin and I. We had a great life, a great marriage. We still do. It's just different. And so I don't look back with regret, because I know I appreciated it and loved it at the time. So that's the first thing. The second thing is not so much a regret, it's more a miss. I miss the sheep. I really do. I didn't think I would. I thought, thank God, no more being knocked over by hungry ewes, no more getting up at 2 o'clock in the morning to pull out twisted triplets in the middle of the night and all this sort of thing. But the truth is, I do miss them. So I have addressed the matter, and I have become a volunteer shepherd for the Leicestershire and Rutland Wildlife Trust. And they have a very small flock of Hebrideans, and I am one of 3 volunteer shepherds who help look after them. And that's gone a long way to relieving the withdrawal symptoms, if you like, of having the sheep.
You know, I didn't know that. So
no, it's quite new, actually.
That's something I found out as well.
I know. I thought I'd keep a few surprises for you.
Well, you've managed it, so there you go. All right. So, next question then. You said to me more than once that the biggest aim from now on is to make Martin's life as good as it can be. and you've done that. I know you've done that, but that must put limits on things that you can look for to achieve for yourself. I mean, you've just told us actually something that you have managed to achieve for yourself, but, and you might have already answered this question by what you've just said, but, you know, how do you deal with that, that in effect your choice is always going to come second?
Well, I toyed with putting the sheep thing into this section, but there are other answers to that question. So yes, I very much now see my role as making Martin's life as happy and as safe, because he's severely disabled, and as comfortable as possible. It's not that I'm a martyr to him. In fact, it's not all altruistic, because it's highly unlikely, if we're being perfectly frank, that I shall outlive Martin. It was probably likely that I would outlive him pre-event, because I'm a woman and I'm 5 years younger than him. But now it's much more likely. And I don't want to spend those remaining years looking back and beating myself up, thinking, I could have done more. I could have done this better. I could have done that for him. So I want to do as much as I can now, because it's almost like an investment for me for the future. So I don't mean that to sound selfish, because Martin's the recipient of this, but it's also, I have to look after my own mental well-being, both now and in the future. And when I referred earlier to the fact that I don't look to the future very much, but I do a little bit, these are one of the ways in which I look to the future. It's about me. So that's one of the things. And the other thing is, I don't want people to get the idea that looking after Martin is some sort of difficulty. It isn't. It's my pleasure to do it. And he constantly delights and surprises us. It may be something as small as very recently, he learned to do his own buttons up of his shirt, even his cuff buttons. You know, a year ago, that was unthinkable. But now he can do that, and he enjoys showing me that he can do it. And he's now able to almost sit up by himself in bed, almost. And that's going to come, that's going to happen. So he rewards me for my work in many ways, all day, every day. But most of all, his sense of humour is so intact, Mark. And you know what a slightly quirky sense of humour he had. It's still there. He is still Martin. And that's the reward I need.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. Yeah, well, you know, we all hope, don't we, that we keep on getting those little improvements and those little changes. And, you know, from what you and I saw right at the beginning, it's incredible he's got to where he's got to now.
Yeah, I mean, there's one very funny story. It's a lovely story. It only happened a couple of weeks ago. He has a speech and language therapist come to help him with his words, and he's making huge progress with his vocabulary. And she was saying, now, Martin, we're going to be talking about idioms today. So if I tell you what the idiom is, will you tell me what it literally means and what it actually means? So she said, to kill two birds with one stone. What does that mean, Martin? He said, it means you're a bloody good shot. And it's just little perlers like that you know he's still in there,
yeah.
and he can sometimes access it and bring it out for us. And we all, you know, we all dined off that for a week, believe me.
Well, there you go. You've already slightly touched on this. I seldom hand out advice, but I had a friend who was in a similar position to that which you find yourself in now, and he told me that the biggest challenge for him was to make sure that the relationship that he had started with that person remained the relationship going forward. So, you know, he was husband, she was wife, and then they ended up in a very similar situation to you. And I remember, if I've said anything to you, it was somehow, Janet, you need to avoid becoming Martin's carer rather than his partner. And I just wonder what your take on that is.
I think it's so important that Martin and I retain that adult husband-wife relationship. and that it doesn't slip into a parent-child scenario. I think if it were to do that, it could breed resentment, anguish, and all those negative emotions that I have thus far navigated and tried to avoid, despite being told that I would feel all those things. I don't. But I think if it were that I were to become his carer, it would very easily spiral down into a parent-child relationship. So we have carers come in for Martin, and I'm going to talk about this later on, so I don't want to say too much about it now, but I am not Martin's carer or his nurse. I am his wife. And of course there are times when carers don't turn up where I have to turn my hand to everything, but on the whole I don't. And one of the ways we sort of do this is we try and recreate normal situations that we had before the event. And one of them was in the evening after work, we would come together and I would cook the dinner, and he would, while I was cooking, he would tell me about his day, I'd tell him about mine, we'd have a drink and supper. And so every night now, Martin comes into my area, because we've got some private areas in the house where the carers don't go, and it's just him and I for 2.5 hours from 5:30 to 8 o'clock. We have a chat. He comes into my kitchen and watches me cook. We have a drink, only though, of course, now there is no alcohol allowed because of his medications. And we have supper and eat together exactly as it was before. And that's quite important, to recreate some of those old norms and some of those old ways that you have. And that helps too, you know, and I ask him his advice on things. And sometimes it's actually a little bit more insightful than you might think.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that. I mean, that's great, because it's about maintaining what you've had, isn't it? And okay, it can't be exactly how it was before, but the fact that you can have those conversations. I said to Janet when we were having the thoughts about this that we probably need a couple of lighter bits in here. So both of the stories I'm going to tell you, the light bits, don't reflect on me at all well, and why I've put them in, I don't know in some ways. But Janet mentioned not having a drink in the evening. I used to stay with Martin quite a lot when I was working for HSBC, and I would go up for a week or even 2 weeks to do some work in London. And I didn't want to stay in a hotel, and then Janet started to be with us as well. But before that, the plan often was I would walk to his chambers in Middle Temple. He would then send me straight back out again to Elvino around the corner, which is a hostelry that sells outsails as well. And I would purchase a bottle of Fleury, and I would take it back. He, I, and maybe one or two others would then sink said bottle before we went back to the flat, possibly via Sainsbury's. And then we would probably have a gin, and we might open a bottle of wine. And there was one famous occasion where we put the steak under the grill. We both fell asleep, and we only woke up when the smoke alarm went off. So we chucked that in the bin. And I can't believe that we did this, but Martin had some more steak, so we put that in, and exactly the same happened about half an hour later. Well, I can't remember what we did end up eating, but I think it was cheese and biscuits by the time we finished, so it was burnt to a crisp. But there you go.
But Mark, I have to tell you, I didn't know the story.
Oh.
So thank you for telling me about that. And I wonder if Margaret knows the story too. I'd be interested to ask her.
She probably will at some point later on when she looks
now
at
she
this.
will.
Yeah. I don't think we told anybody about it, to be honest. Okay, so I would come and ask you another question. I know it's a while back now, but I'm sure people continually say, how's it going? How's Martin getting on? And I just wondered, you know, that sometimes that must be quite a chore to deal with, even though people are interested. And how do you deal with those questions?
They absolutely do ask. I think they ask out of politeness and to demonstrate their sympathy to me for what they know is now my new situation. And I think I realized quite quickly that that is why they were asking. They were asking to demonstrate sympathy and kindness. They weren't actually asking for bare facts. And I latched onto this quite quickly. The other thing I realized is they don't want to hear bad news, really. So I have a bit of a stock reply, and it goes something along the lines of, oh, we're doing okay, thank you very much for asking. You know, we bump along together. It's a bumpy old road and we hit quite a few potholes, but there are still 4 wheels on our wagon. And it seems to satisfy people because it's acknowledging that it's difficult at times, but it's positive in that we're still rolling and we're still upbeat about it, and it seems to satisfy them. And I think that's important, that people aren't being disingenuous when they ask, but they really don't want the facts. They just want to know you're okay. And they want to demonstrate sympathy. So I think the moral of that little story is don't bore people with facts. Just be positive, upbeat, but honest. So that's how I deal with it. You know, unless it's family, and family is a little bit different when they do want a little bit more in depth, but they often come and see Martin in their own right, so they can see for themselves.
Okay, thank you. I can ask you a question now, which might sound a bit similar to one that we talked about before, but it must be really natural and tempting to think, well, why did this have to happen to us? Why did it have to happen at this point when, you know, Martin was looking at whether he might retire and, you know, all those sort of things. The future, as we said before, looked really good. How do you keep that from eating you up?
It's a really good question, and it's a different one from the question you asked earlier, actually. It is difficult, and at first it was harder. I kept thinking I must have done something awfully wrong and evil in my life to be punished like this. But as I went through that 18-month journey of Martin being first in Addenbrooke's, then in Homerton, and then at PJ Care, you meet so many other people in the same position as you. And that's a great leveler. And you realize that it's nothing you did wrong. It's nothing Martin did wrong. It just happened. There's one story I want to tell you, and I am going to struggle to get through it. But my friend Sandra, who you have met several times, Sandra's Jewish, but she has a very strong faith. And she and I get on like a house on fire, and have done for nearly 40 years that we've known each other. And I was moaning to her about 6 months in, you know, oh, why did this happen to us? You know, we were so near to retiring. We had such great plans, you know, plans to travel, plans for the farm and what have you. And she said to me, Janet, God laughs at people who make plans. And I thought, wow, that makes God sound very cruel, very heartless. And I wasn't sure I quite liked her God, but I think what she meant, in fact, I know what she meant because we did discuss it a few months later. What she meant was God has a master plan for each and every one of us. And this is his plan for Martin and I. And I just have to trust that he has a reason for it. And whilst we're all prepared and able to go off and make our own plans for our life, ultimately, it's God's plan that will be done. And so sometimes I find it quite difficult to understand and believe that he's planned this for us. But isn't that what faith's about, Mark? Trusting and accepting the difficult things and knowing that he's got his eye on me and Martin.
Yeah. And knowing that we'll never understand everything.
No. And actually, that's okay. I've sort of made my peace with that.
Yeah. I mean, that's an incredible answer, to be honest, because I think maybe unless you've been through something so severe as that, you know, actually getting to that conclusion, I'm sort of lost for words, really.
But all I can say is, you know, on a more human scale, if all else fails, it is okay to scream into a pillow sometimes, and sometimes I have to.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
That,
well, that very much leads me on to what I was going to ask you next, because if anybody said to me, you know, find, I don't know, 3 words that describe Janet, one of the ones I would definitely use from the time all the time I've known you is capable, because you plan and you think and you're logical. But as we've talked about, you haven't got a cape on your back, and you very seldom, in my knowledge anyway, wear your pants on the outside. So when you're really, really stuck, when you really don't know what to do next, what do you do?
oh, Mark, that was one of the hardest lessons of all of this. It was to realise and admit that I am not Superwoman, because I really thought I was at times. You know, I thought, oh, there's nothing I can't achieve. There's nothing I can't do with a bit of effort and a bit of knowledge. But I'm not Superwoman. And what I've learned is that it is okay to ask for help. It was very difficult at first, and if I'm honest, it still doesn't sit completely comfortably with me to ask people for help. But when you do and they respond, it's a wonderful feeling that people want to help you. And also, it gives people who do give you the help, it makes them feel useful, because when all this happened, so many people said, oh my God, you know, I feel useless to you, Janet. You know, if ever I can help you, please let me know. And I just sort of shrugged it off and thought, yeah, like I ever would. I never asked for help. Why would I suddenly? But you do. The caveat to it is that to think carefully who you ask and for what. And I have found it's really important to ask the right things of the appropriate and right people. Otherwise, 2 things happen. You embarrass people because they have to say, no, I can't help you, Janet. And that's an embarrassment to them. And that's not fair when they've offered to help. Or they disappoint you because they're not in their right sphere of influence, or they haven't got the time to do it, or you just misunderstood the messages from them. So I think very carefully about what I ask of people, and that way I have had quite a high degree of success that people do want to help me. And of course, the other side of the coin is it makes you want to help people in return. And that's probably one of the most rewarding things that's come out of this, that I now seek out ways of helping other people. And when people ask me for help, I say, yes, if I possibly can help you, I will. And I do. And just little things like, there's a little boy that lives over the road, and his father's a farming hand. And he had some caged lambs in the back garden in the summer, last summer, not this summer, just gone, the summer before. And I caught him crying outside the house one day. I said, Alfie, what's the matter? And he said, oh, someone's reported me for having the lambs, the caged lambs in the garden, because we're not allowed to have them. He said, and so, you know, I've got to get rid of them. They've got to go to the abattoir. They've got to be killed. And I said, no, they haven't. I've still got my farm. So you bring them down to me. So I went off and I got my trailer and I put the lambs in my trailer and I took them down to Church Farm. And I said, you've got 3 or 4 months. And by then they'll be big enough to grow and, you know, you'll be able to think about what you're going to do. And it was the smallest thing, but it put the biggest smile on that little boy's face. And it ingratiated me, if you like, into the community here in a new village that, oh, she's got time for other people with all that on her plate. And it was a nice feeling.
Oh, well, there you are. That's another story I didn't know that I've learnt of today. So all sorts of other things. When we were talking about what we might talk about, you said one thing which sort of didn't fit naturally in with everything else, but I still wanted to ask you. You wrote to me that you said, I have learned tolerance of other people's choices in life. And I just wondered what it was that you meant by that.
Yeah, the tolerance, I think it's a bit of a catch-all word for some other qualities that I perhaps didn't score quite as highly on as I could, like patience and consideration. Martin needs 24/7 care by 2 carers, and so I have a live-in carer who actually lives in the house, and I have a small army of daily carers who come and go on rotas for the 12 hours that Martin's awake during the day. So when you are outnumbered in your own home, it's not a comfortable feeling. And you could either go crazy and sort of let everything annoy you, or you can accept that so long as we are all pointing in the same direction, and that direction is Martin's well-being, then there are many routes to achieving that. And it doesn't have to be my route and my way. And that if other people do things in a different way, and it still results in the target, which is Martin's well-being, that's okay. And when you have a lot of different carers coming in and out of your house, they have very different lifestyles to me. And I would have seen some of them as perhaps slightly chaotic in the past. But now I realise that they have just got different solutions to their life issues than me. And that's okay, because, you know, they're getting through every bit as well as I am. That's what I meant.
Thank you. Thank you. There are 2 others that live in your household that you have to go and walk every day. And I know you have a delight in both of them. So when you take the dogs for a walk, you told me you did something else as well.
Yeah, and I did this quite naturally, and I have since found out that it's a mindfulness technique, but I didn't do it for that reason. I sort of, you know, got a bit down and a bit depressed from time to time with all that was happening in my life. So when I walked the dogs, I used to try and make myself think of 3 things that I was grateful for. And it might have been that it was a beautiful morning. It might have been that I could hear a woodpecker. And I was fortunate enough to be in a lovely country environment where I could hear such small nuances. It might be that I was so grateful to have wonderful family and friends. And that helped me. And I tried not to think of the same 3 things every day, because it gets quite difficult. You know, it's 18 months, no, it's 3 years in, 18 months since he came home, 3 years in. And I just try and think of different things every day. And the other thing I do, and I didn't tell you about this either, because this occurred to me afterwards when I was thinking about it when I was walking the dogs one day, and I suddenly thought, oh, I didn't tell him this, which is I sing out loud when I'm walking. And that I find incredibly helpful. And it's mainly hymns that I sing. Right. I find them very uplifting, and I choose a hymn that's appropriate to my mood or the circumstances. So it might be All Things Bright and Beautiful if it's a lovely, sunny, bright, cold morning. It might be Lord of All Hopefulness. And if I'm feeling a bit demotivated, it's probably something like Onward Christian Soldiers. And I do, and and I'll march along to it, and I find it helpful and uplifting. It's not always hymns, but it's largely hymns. Yeah. If I meet another walker, I'd look around and say, who's that crazy person?
Oh, well, I'm sure we were right to be a bit crazy at times. I said there were a couple of times when I was going to tell some stories against me, and this is leading on to the last thing I'm going to ask Janet. Because when I look back, I tend to focus on the things that make me smile. And so I thought I was going to remind Janet of one evening when I was staying with Martin and Janet when they had a flat in Battersea before they moved to the house that she talked about selling. And it was on the 1st floor. And normally we would travel back together, because I would walk to Chambers and we would all head off in the car for the evening. But you and Martin had gone to some drinks do or something or other. So I took myself back to Battersea. I walked in the front door of the flat, and it was a bit smelly because the rubbish bag was there to go out for the next day. And because it started to smell, I thought, well, I probably ought to take this out. So I picked the bag up, walked out the door, and as soon as I walked out the door slammed behind me, and I realised I was locked out. Now, this didn't particularly bother me at the time because clearly Martin and Janet, I assumed, had a set of keys, probably each. So the only person that was going to have a problem with this was me. So when they rolled up a little later and I was sitting on the steps outside, and they said, "What are you doing sitting on the steps outside?" I said, "Well, I seem to have managed to lock myself out." Over a period of a few minutes, we then came to the realization that the only set of keys between the three of us that we had, and I think it also included a trip back to Chambers to see whether there was a set there. So it probably was slightly more than a few minutes. We ended up with a position where we realized that the only set of keys that we got was the set of keys that I'd got. Anyway, Martin knew of a ladder in the building, so he went and got this ladder. Janet sat in the car trying to work out a way to get hold of a locksmith, and I think actually did start to get hold of one. He'd been obviously doing his job all day. I'd been doing mine all day. We were both pretty smartly dressed in some, reasonably sharp suits. So Martin put the ladder up to the windows to see whether there might be a window that we might be able to open. So he went up the ladder. I was standing at the bottom of the ladder, and the chap came along walking his dog, and he stopped and he looked at us both and he went, "Are you two burglars?" I might say Martin wasn't overly impressed by this point. And he looked down at the gentleman and he said, and I won't tell you all of the words that he used, but he said, "Do we look like burglars?" And this chap took one look at both of us and he went, "Actually, no, you don't." And he just wandered off. So that sort of taught me that, well, if you want to burgle somewhere in London, wear a decent suit, and you probably get away with it. Well, you'll probably guess by now that I've never been allowed to forget this incident, and any time a set of keys is mentioned, some barb is pointed in my direction about not allowing me to have them. So I'm wondering, even with everything that's happened, and you've already told us of one, but do moments like that still occur? Are there things you can look back on and chuckle about?
Of course there is. And Mark, I knew when you first asked me to do this, I knew you were going to try and work that story in about the keys because you would want to get it in before I did. So you've robbed me of that little story. But of course, the problem we have with Martin is that Martin's short-term memory is virtually non-existent, but his long-term memory is a little bit better, particularly for things that happened more than about 15 years ago. So I dig up some little in-jokes and little sayings that we had as a couple that always used to make us chuckle and smile together. And one of them was a phrase of Martin's, which was, "I'm being a helpful person." And this was because if I was cooking in the kitchen, there would be sort of saucepans and pots and spoons and knives lying around. And Martin would usually be in the kitchen with me. And he would be hovering at my shoulder the whole time, you see. And if I put a saucepan down, it would be whizzed off and put into the dishwasher. And if I put a spoon down, it would be whizzed into the dishwasher. And then I'd turn around and say, "Where's that knife I had?" And he said, "Oh, it's in the dishwasher." And I'd say, "But I need it." And he'd say, "Oh, but I'm being a helpful person." And I still say that now. So sometimes when he gets a bit rattled with me, because I'm trying to be a carer and he doesn't like that, I'll say, "But darling, I'm trying to be a helpful person." And he remembers it and he'll chuckle and he'll smile. And we've got 2 or 3 little sayings like that. And at moments that I just need him to chuckle or smile and become a little bit lighthearted, I'll try and bring them into the conversation. It usually works, but that's about as good as it gets because his memory is so poor. But we have lots of laughs together, Mark. Lots.
Yeah. And it's like you say, it's latching on to those things that he remembers, isn't it? It's
yes.
People say this with people that have got dementia and Alzheimer's. You've got to find the way in and occasionally you'll just find the way in, and that leads to something else. And
Yeah.
and you know, we all know that's sometimes where we are with Martin. You can say one word and suddenly something will click with him, and you go, yeah. Listen, this has been amazing. Thank you. You've been really brave to do this, and I'm so grateful for it. It's stuff that I've wanted to talk to you about anyway in the past, and I haven't done. And now I've asked you to do it in front of loads of other people, so I apologise. But hopefully it will give other people insight into, you know, things that happen and the way that people deal with them. And you've been incredibly honest and brave and insightful, I have to say, in lots of ways. So I just want to say a real big thank you for that.
Well, it's been my pleasure. And the reason I wanted to do it, Mark, was because if any of it resonates with anybody out there, then that is, as I was saying before, it's just a little way I can maybe give back and make people feel that there is a way through. It doesn't always feel like there is, but there is.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So for the home team, you've probably been looking at this all the time and thinking that's not anything of Mark's behind him. I'm actually sitting in the rectory at the moment because I had a meeting with Gary before I wanted to talk to Janet. And the point being is talking about church and stuff. Obviously, tomorrow, Sunday, we have got the Vision Day, which is at St Mary's. So we'd love as many people as possible to come to that. Sorry, I should say St Mary's in Fordingbridge, given we've got 3 St Mary's. St Mary's in Fordingbridge. So if you can come along to that, please do. If you can't, I know there are some online options to work with as well. And then, of course, during the week, there'll be somebody doing the thought for the day at 10 o'clock. So I'd like to wish you all well. I'd like to say thank you to Janet again. And I hope this has been a useful conversation for those of you listening. Thank you.
Lord,